Hello, everybody. I will now choose the subject, which is sort of wintry subject on the melancholy, sadness, depression. But before I do that, I want to thank you all for the subscriptions, and I also want to thank Grace for this lovely, lovely scarf, quite cheerful considering the subject. But in this subject, there are also cheerful notes. It's not all doom and gloom, as I hope I will convey that to you. There are many, many words used, possibly sometimes poetically, sometimes as if they were equal to one another, like disenchantment or sadness or melancholy or depression or indeed grief. So I will wonder about the differences about that. But at the beginning, as usual, let me just read you something, a little mid-winter prayer. I am grateful for that which I have. I am not sorrowful for that which I do not. I have more than others and less than some. But regardless, I am blessed with what is mine. And that's a lovely meditation, particularly in regards to, say, my grief or my melancholy and my sadness, my losses. And how can we be glad about that? Maybe, just maybe, in all that, there is a great learning, great letting go, great understanding, great homecoming. So let's see what we can do with the subject. As somebody, it was a Russian poet once said, the soulless have no need of melancholia. Kierkegaard once said that my melancholy is the most faithful mistress. So why is it that many people talk about melancholy as a companion? What is the difference between, say, melancholy and sadness? What is the difference? And when one is melancholic, sometimes people say that terribly clever people, very poetic people are melancholic, and basic souls don't suffer from melancholia, the same as headaches, you know. I've heard many times that the perpetual headaches, it's only a kind of property of terribly sensitive souls. Well, I would question that. It could be all sorts of other reasons why we have headaches, but there is a little depth to that. So we can consider ourselves lucky that we can wonder about it and see whether we can make some sense out of it. Barbellion, who have written a book, The Journal of Disappointed Men, once said, youth is an intoxication without wine, someone says. Life is intoxication. The only sober man is the melancholic, who disenchanted looks at life and sees it as it is really and wants to cut his throat. For this to be so, I want to be very drunk. So a melancholy is connected to disappointment with reality, as he said it. But is it really? It's a different melancholy. I always say it's not like depression. Depression is a kind of a condition. It could be an organic condition. It could be unresolved, indeed, grief or other issues. And melancholy is a sort of a situation which is sometimes comes as a kind of unresolved cutting off from your own essence, and sometimes after a deep grief and letting go, you kind of stay with melancholy. So it's as many poets and artists would say, melancholy is a sort of company, and depression is a kind of condition. So where does sadness come into that? Where is sadness in relationship to melancholy, and where is sadness in the relationship to grief? Um, Sadness very often imprisoned us in a sense of life imprisonment. We can have a sadness which is about unresolved grief. We can have a sadness which is about losses which were also it's part of grief, which are not acknowledged. We can be, as addicts, addicted to sadness. And that's something which we not explore. As I always used to say to people, are you unhappy because you're sad, or are you unhappy because your mistress is a melancholic, or are you unhappy because you are grief-stricken and you don't even know it? We will go later on into grief. So they are different states, and in some way a similar state. The grief, of course, it's something which frees us, but very often we cannot go to grief because we are stuck at the sadness, or we are indeed stuck with melancholy. I will quote William Shakespeare about from the Much Ado About Nothing. There is a little of the melancholy element in her, my lord. She's never sad, but when she sleeps. And not even sad then, for I have heard my daughter that she have after dreamt of unhappiness and waken herself with laughing. Very useful use of dream. Most people, particularly men, often say that melancholy is a sort of philosophical time, or that philosophers are often melancholic, or poets are often melancholic. Maybe they are just transforming their sadness, their grief into words and into melancholy. We must understand and appreciate those different states for us to be free. Baudelaire, I remember reading, said, that anybody who appreciates beauty and anybody who appreciates life will be connected to melancholy. Whereas, for instance, depression is a completely different state, because depression serves all the attachment. Depression means we are in a kind of grief which cannot be even named or released very often. Melancholy kind of can be a preceding this kind of sense of loss. Therefore, we must move towards grieving. Grieving is a very complex situation because we can grieve a person, we can grieve a loss of our job, so we can grieve loss of opportunities, we can grieve a lot of stuff, and without the grief we cannot move on. In my trade as a therapist, I often deal with rage, anger, and grief. Rage is in a sense accumulation of those three. Rage is accumulation of unresolved grief. It's accumulation of unresolved disappointments. It's accumulation of unresolved anger. So again, like sadness and grief and melancholy, rage is something much more powerful than those three elements. So we therefore, in order not to be stuck with rage and really frozen in that suspense, must go to grief. Not often possible. We're frightened because grief viscerally feels like fear or even terror. People very often don't realize that. Grief also exhausts us beyond a physical well-being. So we have to take time, and we also have to rest a lot when we are in grief. Life must be grief. I remember a couple of people who trained me and a few colleagues in the time of Princess Diana's death. And when they came to England, they commented, "We have never ever seen a less grief country than this, and we've been to many." And I tend to kind of agree with them, but I also told them that if you go to my country, which is Poland, there will be even more shock. So we can turn grief into hysteria, into acting out, into all sorts of things. And grief is necessary to uplift our sadness. So hence the connection. Melancholy is slightly much more complex word, but to uplift the sadness, we have to go through grief. So it's in a sense, we kind of have to joyfully move into grief, because grief suggests that we were able to laugh. It suggests that we are capable of deep feeling. And in that, it's also a puzzlement to many people. I suggest, how can you joyfully grieve? Very easily. I often ask people, what broke your heart so hard and so bad that you close every door and cannot even enter the world of grief? So we are, in that ways, we are sealed completely into the a deadness. Viktor Frank, in his Courage to Suffer book, said, "But there was no need to be ashamed of tears, for tears bore witness that a man had the greatest of courage, the courage to suffer." Helen Keller once said, "What we once enjoyed and deeply loved, we can never lose, because it stays and remains in our heart." The deeper the sorrow, as Khalil Gibran said, carves into your being, the more joy you can obtain. It's very interesting, the paradox of connecting joyful grieving to joy as joy. As Shakespeare once said, "Well, everyone can master a grief, but he that hasn't." Grief is a capacity to laugh. Grief is a capacity to be alive. Grief is capacity to let go. It takes therefore a courage. It takes more courage to cope and work through the grief than to cope and work through shame or anger. And often in my practice, people somehow believe that once they process the anger and shame, that they're okay. We cannot move on unless we grieve what we lost. It's almost like, as I see it, that there is a sacredness in those tears. It's not a weakness, quite the contrary. It's incredibly important. Often I say to addicts when I work with them that addiction can be used in replace the grief. It's almost like a pathological reaction to unresolved grief and unresolved other feeling. But definitely when you suppress the grief, you cannot really rebuild your life, you cannot reconnect to your life. So grief frees us. Grief it makes us feel more profoundly in touch with ourselves. And it is like a medicine. It exposes our emotions to ourselves. If we lose, we have to grieve. Grief is teaching us what it needs to be healed. African people always say that tears are heavenly rain, and many other Asian, Japanese, I think, talk about tears as a soup of sorrow. So it is important for you to realize that we cannot actually get rid of our sadness, get rid of our even melancholy, though melancholy is much more revered state of mind, until we grieve. Winnie the Pooh once said, "If there ever comes a day where we can't be together, keep me in your heart, and I will stay there forever." It is important to observe that if we grieve, we make room for other things. We make room for ourselves. The losses of life are natural to us, and unless we grieve them, we stay maybe more melancholy than we wish for, and more sad. Even Queen Elizabeth II was said that the grief is the price for the fact that we love. It is important to comprehend what matters to us, what is a spiritual journey through the grief. Grief is the price we pay for love, as the Queen Elizabeth said. Kibble Ross, who was involved with grief and hospices, magnificent woman, once said, "The reality is that you will grieve forever. You will not get over the loss of a loved one. You will learn to live with it, you will heal, and you will rebuild yourself around the loss you have suffered. You will be whole again, but you will never be the same. Nor should you be the same now, or nor would you want it." So let's say serenity prayer on that. God, grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, courage to change the things I can, and the wisdom to know the difference. Happy New Year. Bye for now.